Hi everyone, and welcome to this Innovating for Good Google Hangout. I'm Chris Ernie from UNHCR. Innovating for Good is a monthly Google Hangout series hosted by UNHCR Innovation and Plus Social Good that aims to spark conversations on innovation in the humanitarian sector. Each month we broadcast different topics as part of the Innovating for Good series. On this sixth Hangout, we're bringing together an amazing panel to discuss refugee economies. So let me introduce the panel. First of all, we have Naoiko Amata. Prior to joining the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford University, now as a Senior Teaching Fellow in Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, at the University of London. Previously, he worked as a practitioner and consultant for UNDP, UNHCR, and the international and local NGOs in various sub-Saharan African countries. Based on extensive research in West Africa, Nao's published widely on a range of refugee livelihoods, rights and repatriation, including articles in the Journal of Refugee Studies and Forced Migration Review. Before starting his career in forced migration and international development, he worked in the private sector in Japan and the United States. The next person I wanted to introduce is Flavie. Flavie Halle is a Montreal-based freelance journalist covering international development and social issues. Her current project, Refugee Economies, looks at the economic dimensions of refugee crises in East Africa and their implication for humanitarian assistance and policy making. Robert Hakiza, the third panelist, is a refugee from the Democratic Republic of Congo, living in Uganda since 2008. He holds a degree in agriculture from the Catholic University of Bukavu, DRC, which he gained in 2007. Robert's the co-founder and executive director of Young African Refugees for Integral Development, or YARID, which we'll refer to it as from now on. In 2013, he worked as an assistant researcher in Uganda with the University of Oxford's Humanitarian Innovation Project. In July 2015, he attended a 3-week international summer course on forced migration at the Refugee Studies Centre of Oxford University. He's got a lot of experience working with urban refugees and also works to educate others about obstacles refugees face. You're all very welcome. So, in our July edition of Innovating for Good, we're going to discuss the falsehood of the widely held belief that refugee communities are isolated and dependent on humanitarian aid, and why these claims are inherently inaccurate. We will highlight the positive economic impact refugees can have in host communities and why it's important to go beyond economic considerations when discussing livelihoods and to see social relationships as a key component for long-lasting economic solutions. Before we jump into the conversation, if you're listening to the discussion online, please make sure that you use the hashtag #InnovForGood on Twitter. And to tweet our panelists your questions, we'll answer them in due course in the latter part of the conversation. To our panelists, I just wanted to remind you when you're not speaking, if you could mute yourselves, it will make it a lot easier for our audience to hear the conversation. So now, Robert, let's make sure that we're muted when we're not speaking, and I promise I will do the same. Okay, so now we're just going to move into a couple of questions to open up the conversation. Now, I wanted to place this one to you. When we talk about refugee economies, we often think about what impact it has on the host community, but what often goes unacknowledged is the complexity of refugee economies. What are the common myths you would like to break in this particular conversation?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chris, for this question. By the way, do you hear me okay? Yeah, I just want to check. Yes, okay. Yes, I mean, I think there are a lot of prevailing assumption. The myth is related to impact studies, which is currently really booming worldwide, I believe. And I mean, first of all, in my impression is that impact study tends to go into a very binary approach, meaning that impact study we tend to try to calculate the burden and benefits of hosting refugees and try to just subtract and come up with some kind of simple figures. That's very straightforward, but by doing so, there are a lot of important things will be left out. For example, I mean, in the first place, refugees' economic activities are quite, for example, diverse, and also some of them are, for example, very difficult to capture with that kind of methodologies. And refugees also do make a lot of invisible, intangible benefits to the host communities. For example, one concrete example from Uganda is that a lot of Congolese refugees in Kampala teach tailoring to Ugandan host communities. And these Ugandan host communities use those skills to develop their livelihoods. Right? These kind of things will be very difficult to be captured, so-called impact research. So I think one of the potential risks of that kind of approach will be leaving out some of the complexity, diversity embedded in refugees' economic activities. That's kind of my short reply. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Now, if you just put your mic on mute. Thanks very much for that. Thanks very much for that response. So we're talking about refugee economies. We're talking about the impact that these have on host communities, and we were talking about how this can often go unacknowledged within the complexity of refugee economies. So now I was just giving an overview of the need to really have the most relevant and applicable methodologies to better understand what are often very diverse economic activities within refugee communities. Now, I wanted to ask Flavie, actually. This series is about innovation. It's about refugees. So I wondered if I could ask you, where and how can innovation play a part in this conversation? Can innovative processes change the notion of investing in refugees and refugees investing in themselves? Before we just flick over to you now, if you could just put your microphone on mute, and then Flavie, I'll just hand over to you.
Yes, thanks for this question. So I think, well, first of all, there's a huge need for innovation and innovative programs, because I guess the humanitarian sector right now is finding itself in a situation where it's chronically underfunded, and it has to find new ways to run and operate its programs, and that involves enabling refugees to be a lot more self-reliant than they used to be, than what they used to be. So, but I think what's important to acknowledge is that refugees have actually been investing in themselves for years, and they haven't waited for this mind shift within the humanitarian sector to create opportunities for themselves. So if you look at refugees who live in cities and urban settings, and as well as in camps and settlements, and I speak from my perspective, which is that my project is looking at the specific cases of Uganda and Kenya. So when I visited cities and refugee camps and settlements, I noticed that, of course, refugees have been creating and running their own businesses for years, like restaurants or motor taxis, importing businesses, wholesale businesses. There's even some, I met a family of Somali refugees who are running an electricity distribution scheme in a newer part of the camp of Kakuma, whereby, they have this big diesel power generator, and they able to power about 50 households in their sector like this. And when you look at how the refugees create and run these businesses, and how they're able to gather the startup capital to launch these businesses, they're using a wide array of sort of informal mechanisms, either savings, remittances from family abroad, and also they're investing in each other. So when business people have done well enough for themselves, they start investing in new businesses that they believe will succeed. So these are all financing mechanisms that already exist in camps and cities. So when we talk about innovation, I think a large part of the innovation process has to look at what already exists and what refugees are already doing for themselves, and how can innovation support these systems and processes and perhaps bring them to scale. So, so that's where I see an opportunity for innovation.
Thanks very much, Flavie. That was a great answer and very insightful. So I think the key message here is that innovation should be used to support what already exists and to support what people are already doing. Refugees haven't been waiting for the humanitarian sector to allow them to be more self-reliant. Refugees are just the same as the rest of us are self-reliant, and will explore many different avenues to improve their own conditions. Innovation could be used to scale good practices and to scale things that already work. And I wanted to ask Robert, if I may, when we introduce notions to break the preconceived ideas of refugees and activities in displaced communities, how can we make sure that this conversation is are refugee economies and economics the right words to begin with? And what are the elements that tie into your work specifically that's not purely about economics? And don't forget to unmute yourself there, Robert. We just missed the first part of your answer. Apologies.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for the question. I think, want me to respond to that question, I will start by saying that, of course, there are a lot of preconception about refugees. I don't want to go back or to them as now mentioned some of them. I'm going to say just that I think this needs a lot of, I think, changing of refugee narrative at the local level. I'm going to give like an example here in Kampala, like Uganda where I stay. We have right now, let me just talk about the urban refugees. We have over 80,000 urban refugees today. But you're going to see that despite all these big numbers staying here in Kampala, we don't have any information, we don't have any data of refugees at the local government. Like myself, I can say, I am well known at the Office of Prime Minister, but when I go to, for instance, at Makindye Division here at the local government, where I say, I am not known there. So you're going to see that it is just very difficult for, you know, for people to understand, and especially when you talk about the contribution of refugees, when this information are not captured at the local level, it's really just very difficult. So I think it needs a lot of sensitization at the local level to make sure that at the local government level, we have all this information, because the system here is just all this information as are gathered at the top level there, but when you go down, and it's just very difficult. You can't get any information, and yet that is where many activities, many things that are visible about refugees are concentrated. But also, I think it is very important that the contributions of refugees, you know, are also captured at the national level. I'm talking about economic contribution. You're going to see that many refugees are involved in these economic activities and are making a tremendous, very big contribution. But these contributions are not captured in the national, you know, in the national economy. Yes, I think this. Talking about refugee economics, maybe it may not be the right word to use, because for me, when we talk about refugee economies, it's like we are just trying to separate them like at its own. But maybe we may use the contribution of refugees to the economy of the host country. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. That was an excellent answer. So the importance of stressing the importance of recognizing contributions to economies, whether a refugee or host community, and that refugees play an important role in economics at both the national and local level. So I've got a follow-up question for you then, Robert. Refugees can contribute to economic strength, Are there examples within Uganda that you've noticed that haven't worked?
Yeah, about the contribution of refugees to the economies. Yeah, as I said, and as you've seen in my short bio I sent, I did participate in work with the Humanitarian Innovation Project of Oxford University. That was in 2013, where we worked to research the refugee livelihood and innovation and technology. And this was done here in Kampala and in other refugee settlements here in Uganda. I'm going to give an example for the Congolese refugees in Uganda. Like in Uganda, when you talk, for instance, about the jewelry business, like the necklaces and the stuff that here in Kampala, we directly see the Congolese refugees. There is a big, very big building here in Kampala called Gazaland. When you get in that building, there are, I think, hundreds of shops where they sell this jewelry. So when you go to those shops, majority of them are owned by the Ugandan. These are people who import this jewelry from China, Dubai, and they bring them here. But once here, the refugees play the very big role and actually they are the first customers, and they play a very big role in distributing these necklaces everywhere and up to very deep in the villages and even out of the countries. And this is actually something like, as you talk of the people who are doing, the national people who are doing this business, they are going to tell you that, and of course we talk to them, they say it, this business, we rely to the refugees to do this. We can't imagine this this business without the refugees. And you see, these are the people, and this is a building which is already busy, people entering, getting out. There is a lot of money circulating in that building, and of course these people pay taxes, and also, and it's making, I think, a lot of contribution to the economy of Uganda. I have so many examples. I think I'm going just to stop from that one.
Perfect, thanks, Robert. Flavie, most of us who are watching online, well, most of us who are online watching this are used to formal economies, formal structures of planning, access to capital and work. What we normally don't understand is that most economies in the world are informal. How do you think we can break notions that informal economies are bad? And furthermore, how can we understand that what we can learn from informal economies can give us clues as to how markets work and what the needs are for various communities and societies?
Well, I mean, the debate on informal economies is a really big one, and I think we could have an entire Google Hangout dedicated to, looking at informal economies in a better way. I mean, the first thing that I would say is that we need to recognize that informal economies exist everywhere, not only in developing countries, but in developed countries as well. I think it's been estimated that around 13% of the GDP of developed countries comes from the informal sector. And so that is what we talk about, illegal trade, like the drug trade, but most of it is really undeclared work and undeclared contracts, and a lot of it is actually jobs and employment that is held by undocumented migrants. And it's been proven, of course, that a huge part of the economy of developed countries is supported by this illegal labor. After the economic crisis of 2008, there was actually a huge rise of the informal sector in developed countries, because after a lot of people lost their jobs, of course, that it was the only way that they could support themselves and their families. So in the US, for instance, the black market doubled. It went from $1 trillion to $2 trillion after the 2008 crisis. So I think we need to acknowledge that the binary between formal and informal is a lot less clear than perhaps we may think, and that this gray area that a lot of people operate in, I think, and it's speaking to us perhaps with the specific examples of the new industries that are created by startup companies like Uber or Airbnb. And so we're starting to recognize that there's a lot of industries that operate in this gray zone. Now, to bring it back to refugees, I think there's a lot that we can learn from the way refugees organize their own economy, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of informal business that takes place, because they have no other choice, and most of refugee hosting countries, or at least a large part of them, don't grant them the work rights that are inscribed in the refugee in the 51 Convention on Refugees. So without this right to work, how can they provide for themselves and their families? Well, they have to turn to informal activities. And so there needs to be this reflection on how can we support refugees, but also perhaps undocumented workers, all of the street vendors around the world who are responding to a demand. They exist, and their activities function because because of laws of supply and demand. So if there's a demand for their goods and services, then we need to think of perhaps newer ways or more flexible ways to not necessarily formalize them, but structure their activity, perhaps through new ways to deliver permits and licenses, or new forms of taxation. So, and a lot of researchers are looking into this currently. But one thing I would like to clarify is that a large part of the economic activity of refugees is actually formalized. So, for instance, when I traveled to Kakuma, you see all this economic activity, and you see there's a lot of shops in the streets. And well, when you look at the restaurants, the corner stores, the supermarkets, the wholesale businesses, the bars, all of these businesses are actually paying taxes through the license that they obtain from the local county government. Someone showed me there was about a dozen papers or licenses that they had to purchase in order to operate. And now the problem is that they pay money for these permits, but they don't get any public services in return. Let's say like the road to the Kakuma camp is notorious for being in a very poor condition. The streets in the camp are not paved. So these types of things really inhibit the ability of these business people to do business. And so there's this huge question of why these refugees are allowed to conduct businesses and run businesses, and why they have to pay for permits to do so, and why are they not receiving any types of public services in return. So that's a question that I would like to, that's one of the questions that that came up during my research and the course of my project.
Thanks, Flavie. That's fascinating and a very full answer to that question. Thank you for that. So we started talking about formal economies, access to capital and work, and then informal economies, and actually how refugees are actually a part of both. There are formal structures in place in some places for refugees to work, and in others, of course, there are informal options that people take. I think it's a great suggestion. Maybe we should have an entire hangout on the informal influencing the formal. I'm sure we could start talking about Rem Koolhaas and learning from Lagos, and then I wouldn't be quiet for the entire 30 minutes. But for the time being, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation. We've been talking about what might be we've started to segue into what might be useful in order to help people get access to the informal as well as the informal economies. So I wanted now to ask you, From your perspective, from an academic perspective, so you do an awful lot of field work. You've observed UNHCR, for example, in Uganda around its interactions with refugees in many different settlements in that country. I wanted to ask you, how do you think that humanitarian agencies can help to create an atmosphere, whether that's encompassing the legal, political, economic, or all three, that's more conducive to refugee entrepreneurship?
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a quite important question, and I have a couple of different ideas, and it's a little bit related to already what Robert mentioned and Flavie mentioned, that in a way, first and foremost, in terms of assisting refugees, we have to think about that whether, aid agencies are setting up, or host governments are setting up the so-called enabling conditions for refugees to exercise their capacities agency. For example, Chris already referred to some of the legal aspects. In some countries, refugees are not really allowed to work, but they are significantly restricted to enter like a formal economy, right? And in many countries, refugees are also restricted to move freely. In those cases, it is very difficult for refugees to, they capitalize on their existing capacity. They are able to contribute to the host economy, but with those restrictions, it just makes things very difficult for refugees to do that. And so, first and foremost, we have to think about, okay, do refugees have adequate conditions to become economic actors? That's one thing. And also more in terms of actual assistance, I think I have been seeing a lot of so-called vocational trainings, provision of skills trainings, and they are useful. But without thinking about whether refugees have access to market, giving just the training is not really the solution for refugees to capitalize on the skill they learned. And again, this relates to the restrictions placed on refugees. So when aid agencies, when they provide assistance, we have to think about a little bit more, how do you say, kind of broadly. And then rather than just going into very, very technical aspects of livelihoods, we have to think a little bit more broadly and more comprehensively. And what is the meaning of providing this training? Do refugees, are refugees able to exercise these skills training after they receive the training? And in some cases, like aid agencies, I used to work with agencies, so including myself, we tend to relatively easily blame refugees. We provided training, but they are not self-reliant. Yes, we have to step back and see, whether we have given them sufficient conditions. So we need a little bit of like a holistic approach. That's kind of my short answer.
Okay, thanks now. And just to link to your answer, there's a question from Twitter for specifically for you from John. He says, you've been to camps in Kenya and Uganda. Does your data suggest conditions are the same elsewhere?
Sorry, Chris. Can you just repeat the question?
Of course.
Was it from Kenya? Sorry, can you just repeat that one?
Sure. So a message from John on Twitter. You've been to camps in Kenya and Uganda. Does your data suggest conditions are the same elsewhere?
Short answer, no, because each country has a different way of implementing refugee policies. So my kind of immediate knee-jerk response to that one is that I have probably worked with several different countries, mainly in Africa. No country has exactly the same condition. No.
Thank you. And I'm gonna put the same question to Flavie and then Robert. So Flavie, over to you.
Well, I mean, my project looked specifically at the cases of Kenya and Uganda, and of course, I mean, both countries actually are operating in vastly different conditions, because Uganda has more permissive rules and regulations when it comes to refugees being able to move freely and to work and run their businesses. If you look, I mean, there's a number of research results now that have been analyzing the economic impact in European countries specifically, and these are showing overwhelmingly the positive economic benefit of hosting refugees. And at first, I mean, I think the first studies that I read pointed more towards a long-term result over a period of 15 to 20 years, let's say. But the last one that came out, and I think that was produced by an organization called TENT, showed very short-term benefits under 5 years. And I think it's perhaps relevant that the title of this Hangout is called asking the question of how to invest in refugees, because at a country level, this could be seen as an investment, whereby you have some immediate costs at a national level to bring in refugees and support them for the first few years. But on a more long-term and medium-term basis, there is a clear benefit for European countries, and it's likely to be the same for the rest of developed countries. For developing countries, the challenge is a little bit different, because there needs to be a lot more support in terms of offering the right infrastructure to these countries so that they can be able to support refugees.
Thanks very much, Flavie. And yeah, so Flavie was referring, of course, to Hamdi Ulukay's new organisation, tent.org, I think, and indeed there was some interesting studies released not so long ago about the positive economic effect that refugees can have on host communities. Now, you made a really interesting point about the most of the studies looking at the longer term benefits rather than the shorter term benefits that TENT were trying to highlight. So I wanted to turn over to you, Robert. You've been in Uganda for some time, and you've had the opportunity to experience firsthand the impact that your own communities have had on host communities within Uganda. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, within Uganda, how do you see this impact upon refugee communities have on host communities globally, whether that's in Germany, whether that's in the United States, whether that's in Rwanda or Kenya? Over to you, Robert.
Okay, thanks so much. I think, as now said, and I think each country has normally its own way of handling the refugee thing. But if I can talk, for instance, about here in Uganda, when you look at the policy in place, the policy on refugee policy in Uganda, you're going to see, and actually this is known as one of the best policies in Africa, and I think also in the world, where refugees, are given the opportunity, the right to work, and the freedom of movement. And then you're going to see that the rights and these opportunities that the refugees are given here in Kampala, it's not necessarily the same in Kenya. I have been in Kenya 2 or 3 times, and I think I couldn't feel free the way I am here in Uganda in terms of freedom of movement, and also in terms of doing anything that I want. And of course, this is also based on refugees communicate wherever they are. We have people staying in Kenya, refugees, and we sometimes share this information and try to compare. And you're going to see that when refugees, of course, they are given this opportunity, you know, and for like in Uganda to move and to work. They try to move on their own, you know. They don't not necessarily, you know, expect or wait for UNHCR or the government to come and give them support, as well, because they have already a kind of freedom. They can do whatever they want to do. They can engage in the business. They can organize themselves in association. They can do whatever they want to do, almost at the same level as you know, as the local people. And this, I think, is good because it is avoids at the local level, like when you talk about you look at the host communities, the refugees, you know, they do their things without you know, the local people really as, I mean, when you look at this, the way refugees stay here in Kampala, it's very difficult for you know, for host community to know that this is a refugee. It is really very difficult. Some of them, they don't really know that this is a refugee. They consider them like you know, as any other person who may decide just to leave his country and come to stay in Uganda, like any other migrants. And yeah, I think that is what I can say. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. That's great. So I've got a question from Twitter, from Beak Center. How can we accept refugees so that not only qualities of life increase, but also levels of domestic and international? Which didn't make so much sense to me, so I'm going to rephrase it. Okay, so how can we accept refugees so not only the qualities of life increase, but how can, okay, here's a question from Kian. Apologies, that one was a little bit confusing. This one, Robert, I'm going to ask of you, back to you. So from Kian from Twitter, what are the key tools refugees need in order to be active in host economies?
Can you repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, sorry for that. So this is a question from Kian from Twitter. What are the key tools refugees need in order to be active in host economies?
I think that is very simple, and it is just what I've just talked about a few seconds before here. Refugees need to be to be given. They want to be given the freedom of exercising any activities that they want. They want to be them to be they want to be looked at as people who can also do any other thing like other people. I think it's just the policy, like allowing refugees to move, allowing refugees to do what they want to cater for themselves.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Robert. And then I've got another question from John, again from Twitter. He's asking, and I think this is a great question that I think now you'll be able to answer for us. What can be done to incentivize markets between refugee and host country entrepreneurs? Secondly, have you seen this work?
The question was what was the question? Like the first one, the first phrase.
Sure, let me repeat it for you. Okay, so what can be done to incentivize markets between refugee and host country entrepreneurs? And secondly, have you seen this work? Can you give us any examples?
So how can we give the incentive to the market to basically acknowledge refugees for the country? Is that the way? I mean, can I understand as such? Yeah.
Let's use that. Let's use that rephrasing. Sure, over to you.
Yeah, I think probably first and foremost we want to start with is that you know, in relation to refugees' economic lives or contributions, there's very much lack of research and studies, right? And a lot of things that are so-called perceptions, like sometimes we call myths. You know, myth basically meaning that people discuss, but they don't necessarily have credible evidence. And I think first and foremost, we should be probably starting to change this kind of widespread perceptions, because in order to give the kind of incentive to the market players, first of all, they have to know, who refugees are, what kind of economic lives are they engaged in, and also what kind of contribution they are making. And so that's the kind of first thing to do it. And I don't think I haven't seen. I just cannot say any specific programs that aid agencies have been really doing that one. And but I have, sometimes, like, for example, what I came across is that like diaspora communities, for example, in relation to Somali refugees, Somali people are very well known with their extensive transnational market. And sometimes what they do is that, using the advantage of their location, sometimes Somali diaspora living in Western, let's say Western society, like so-called developed countries, invest in businesses owned by refugees in Uganda or Kenya or probably other countries. And they use that, their actually accessibility to the kind of local markets, and sometimes they often share the profits. I'm not sure this is a kind of good example to answer this question, but in a way, some people are already recognizing, some kind of incentives, some kind of benefits by investing in refugees. So I just give this one example. Yeah, this is more like Somali diaspora communities case.
Thanks. Now that's fantastic. I just wanted to draw people's attention to a tweet from John, who has he's tweeted to us the full report from tent.org. So I'm going to ask if our friends at UNHCR Innovation could just share that with everybody now. It's a great report from tent.org, an organisation started by Hamdu Lakaya. So time for just one more question before we wrap up. And I'm going to put this one to Flavie. We haven't spoken for a little while, and I'm going to check with our colleagues who are running Twitter if there are any questions coming in from Twitter, and there is, which I'm going to give to you, Flavie. So this is from the Alight Fund, and they've said the challenge is how to change policies to make this legal in practice. Any ideas? Hashtag enough for good. So I think I'm going to just rephrase that a little bit. So how can we change policies to make entrepreneurship for refugees in host communities legal in practice? Is there anything that you've seen, Flavie, in your research that has worked particularly well? Any specific examples that you could give to us?
In terms of examples, I don't know on top of my head. I don't know. I'd have to think about it. But what I was wondering, when I was thinking of the questions that we were going to address during the Hangout is, is the fact that, as now mentioned earlier, a lot of the factors that enable economic activity are, are based in policy making. And I was wondering if we could use innovation to address this. So, because when we talk about innovation, we often look at small-scale projects or very localized projects, but there is a very huge need to obviously change the policies on the ground. So, could we use the innovation process to change policies at the national level, to bring countries to perhaps open up the ability of refugees to move freely and to work? Is there some dialogue to be had between UNHCR and its partners with local governments, so that the relationship between the humanitarian sector and local and national governments can change? Because I I've just realized that the relationship between the humanitarian sector and the government has often been based in it was created in a vastly different context in the 1980s, when the nature of the refugee crisis was vastly different, and the humanitarian sector was well funded. So, and now we're facing different types of challenges, and we need to redefine the relationship between all the different actors. And next, I'm interested in looking at how can we help local and national governments change and maybe come up with new policies that affect both the refugee population and the host populations, because there's really no difference either in the camps or in cities. The host population is invariably impacted by the presence of refugees, but it can also benefit largely from using some of the health services and education services or skills training offered to refugees. And so I'm also especially interested in figuring out how can cities better address the challenge of urban refugees, because as we know, an increasing a part of the refugee population now lives in urban areas. But in developing countries, cities don't have any sort of policy to address the inflow of refugees. So, for instance, refugee children go to school, refugees use health services, but there's no clear policy to deal with this. How are we going to house refugees? What kind of housing policy can help countries and cities deal with the incoming flows of refugees? So unfortunately I don't have answers, but I just have a lot of questions on where I think innovation could help to address these questions.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Flavie. I think you raise a really important point, and this is something that we struggle with all the time over here at UNHCR Innovation, and it's really how we can use innovation to influence policies. How we can innovate in and around policies and have a different approach sometimes, particularly internally, when we look at issues of scale or adoption or diffusion. We look at creating an environment for innovation to take place, for scale to occur, and typically we look at money, of course. The organisation having money, enough money to scale particular innovations. Secondly, we look at communication around those innovations, so that people understand exactly what the innovations are, the journey that they've taken. And then the third key to scale and that enabling environment really is policy related, and then giving people the policy tools and guidance that can further enable innovation. So I like the questions that you've asked. I think we're going to answer some of those through the course of this Google Hangout series. Unfortunately for today, that's all we've got time for this Google Hangout. I wanted to thank I wanted to thank Robert, and I wanted to thank Flavie. Thanks to all of you guys for joining us today. You've all been wonderful, which we expected. We had high expectations of you. So thanks to you for joining us and having this conversation with us, and thanks also to the viewers and people on social media who have been engaging with us. If you do have more thoughts, we encourage you to continue the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag #InnovForGood. Lastly, this Hangout will be available online on the Plus Social Good YouTube channel, and also the UNHCR Innovation YouTube channel. My name's Chris Ernie, the co-lead of UNHCR Innovation. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.